The courtroom was full before the doors even closed. Reporters lined the back wall. Legal interns filled the benches. And at the center of it all sat Judge Edward Chen, confident, composed, and completely in control. He had a reputation. Years of rulings, thousands of hours on the bench, and a quiet but well-known tendency to humiliate attorneys he didn't like. The courtroom called it charisma. His clerks called it theater. But most people just called it what it was. Power. Pam Bondi stepped in quietly. No press entourage, no flurry of aides. Just a folder tucked under one arm and her pace steady. She nodded to the clerk, took her place at the counsel table, and waited. Edward Chen didn't look up right away. He was reading something, or pretending to. A pause long enough to feel like a warning. Then he glanced up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Bondi," he said, voice smooth. "I see you're representing yourself. Ambitious." Pam didn't react. "Yes, Your Honor." He tapped his pen lightly against his notepad. "Let's hope ambition doesn't outpace preparation." The courtroom chuckled. Not loudly, but loud enough. Pam's face didn't change. "I'm prepared, Your Honor." Edward leaned back. "We'll see." The case was simple on paper. A procedural matter. A motion to unseal records tied to a closed ethics complaint involving federal funds. But everyone in that room knew it wasn't about paperwork. It was about what those records implied. And more than that, it was about who was sitting on the bench. Judge Chen wasn't just the presiding judge. He was mentioned, not directly, but clearly, in the internal complaint that Pam Bondi had just managed to force into the daylight. This wasn't about protocol. This was about exposure. And Edward Chen knew it. So he leaned into his comfort zone. "Ridicule. Counselor," he said, barely looking at the motion Pam had submitted. "You've cited 3 precedents here. One from 1984, one from a civil dispute in the Ninth Circuit, and one," he paused, holding the page up, "from a state ruling that was overturned." Pam nodded. "That's correct. The context in each." He held up a finger. "Let me finish, please." The finger stayed up a beat too long. Then he smiled. "This courtroom doesn't reward Google research, Ms. Bondi. I suggest you review what counts as precedent in a federal courtroom." A few people laughed. Pam didn't move. "I'm familiar with precedent, Your Honor," she said. "Those citations aren't arbitrary. They speak to patterns of concealment that are relevant here." Chen exhaled. "Patterns of concealment. That's quite the phrase. Do you also have a PowerPoint?" More laughter. Slightly louder this time. Pam turned her head slightly toward the gallery, then back to him. "I have evidence." He looked amused. "Is that what we're calling speculation now?" The laughter stopped. Not because the line didn't land, but because something in Pam's expression had shifted. Just slightly. She placed the folder on the table. "I request the court review exhibits B through F." Chen flipped the page in front of him, almost performatively. Then he waved it off. "We'll get to that." Pam didn't push. She sat still, hands folded, eyes focused. The same way someone waits for the next move in a game they've already memorized. Chen adjusted his robe, then turned to the court recorder. "Please note for the record, the court cautions counsel not to waste time with recycled arguments. We're here to address facts, not feelings." It was said with a smile, but it was a strike, and it landed. Pam didn't flinch, but the message was clear. She wasn't welcome here. Not as an attorney, not as a voice, and especially not as someone holding evidence against the man in charge. Edward Chen leaned back, relaxed now, the room fully under his grip. He nodded once toward her. "Continue, Ms. Bondi, if you insist." But she didn't respond immediately. She opened the folder, slid out a thin stack of pages, and placed them neatly on the table. Then she spoke, quietly. "For the record, Your Honor, I'd like to clarify that I am not here to offer feelings. I'm here to show, in detail, how a series of decisions made under your authority resulted in the suppression of federal oversight." That changed the air. It wasn't the words. It was the tone. Measured. Unemotional. Exact. Chen's smile faltered. "Only slightly." "You may proceed," he said. Pam stood, and the room, for the first time all day, leaned in. Because the judge still held the gavel. But something in the room had shifted. She wasn't here to impress him. She was here to outlast him. and he didn't know it yet. But his courtroom, was about to change. Not with a headline, not with an outburst, but with one document at a time, and the quiet unraveling of a man who believed he couldn't be touched. Pam Bondi didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace or gesture or appeal to the crowd. She simply read, "These are internal oversight memos from the Office of the Inspector General," she said. Each one marked confidential. Each one ignored. She placed the documents on the evidence table, page by page, like laying down cards in a game no one else knew had already been won. Judge Chen leaned forward slightly, scanning the text. His expression didn't change, but his left hand tapped once against the bench. Tap. Pause. Tap again. The room noticed. Pam kept speaking. "These memos reference specific rulings from your docket, Your Honor. In each case, they point to unusual delays, unexplained sealing of records, and rulings that contradict statutory guidelines regarding transparency in federally monitored funds." Chen interrupted. "Counselor, are you accusing this court of misconduct?" "No, Your Honor," Pam said without blinking. "I'm letting the memos do that for me." Someone in the gallery exhaled too loudly. The court clerk shot them a warning look. Edward Chen cleared his throat. "Then let's be clear. Are you suggesting that I personally influenced the sealing of records in violation of federal procedure?" Pam stepped forward slightly, holding up a final document. "This is the email, Your Honor, from your chambers, dated 14 months ago, instructing the clerk to bypass the usual approval chain." She didn't raise it like a weapon. She held it like a fact, because it was. For a second, the courtroom was quiet. Too quiet. Judge Chen didn't look at the page. He looked at Pam. Then he smiled. The smile was thin. "The court finds this line of argument speculative and bordering on contempt." Pam didn't move. "Then charge me," she said quietly. Chen blinked. The courtroom didn't gasp, but it stopped breathing. Pam continued, "If this court believes I'm in contempt, it has the authority to act. But if it doesn't, then I request the record reflect the judge's unwillingness to address documented misconduct." Edward Chen sat back. There it was. A line had been crossed, not by volume, not by rage, but by clarity. Pam had just challenged his authority, not emotionally, legally, and he had no immediate answer. He reached for his water glass, but didn't drink. He scanned the gallery instead, looking not for answers, but for presence. Witnesses. Eyes. Then he looked down at the document she'd submitted. For the first time, he read it. It was real, and it was signed. Pam waited, and the silence grew heavy. The court reporter kept typing. The gallery sat frozen. Even the air felt still. Then Judge Chen spoke, quietly. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." But the damage was done. Because the request hadn't come from him. It had come from pressure, and everyone knew it. He stood, gathered his papers with a little too much force, and exited the bench without looking at Pam. She remained standing, still composed. She hadn't won yet. But for the first time, the bench didn't feel untouchable. Judge Edward Chen returned from recess with slower steps. He didn't sit immediately. He adjusted the mic, smoothed his robe, then sat down, clearing his throat softly before speaking. "We will continue," he said. But it didn't sound like before. His voice was measured now, almost unsure. The courtroom could feel it. The shift was real. The control he once held like a weapon had thinned, like fog giving way to light. Pam Bondi stood. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to enter into the record an affidavit from the Federal Oversight Committee that authored the memos previously submitted." Judge Chen hesitated, then nodded once. Admitted. The affidavit was short, less than 2 pages. But it was signed, and the signature was not political. It was procedural, a senior auditor, a name known across federal courtrooms. Not for opinions, for facts. Pam read the first paragraph aloud. "In the review of sealed cases tied to federal fund mismanagement, we identified anomalous behavior consistent with internal obstruction. These anomalies include judicial orders issued without clerk timestamp, docket entries modified without chain-of-command signatures, and record sealing conducted outside standard legal review." She stopped there. She didn't need to go further. The courtroom had heard enough. Chen adjusted his seat. I remind counsel that this proceeding is not a trial, he said, voice tighter now. And the bench is not on trial. Pam looked directly at him. No, Your Honor, she said. Not yet. A murmur passed through the gallery. Not outrage. Recognition. This wasn't emotion anymore. It was a mirror. Chen looked toward his clerk, then toward the exit doors. And that was when the door at the back of the courtroom opened again. 2 men entered. One in a dark gray suit, the other with a small badge visible at his waist. U.S. Marshals. They didn't speak. They walked to the bench. Calm. Intentional. Chen didn't rise. The lead marshal handed a folded document to the clerk, who opened it with trembling hands. The clerk looked at the judge, eyes wide, then nodded. This court has received a signed federal order for immediate review of judicial conduct under Title 18, Section 242, the marshal announced. Pam remained still. Judge Chen didn't speak. The marshal stepped forward. Edward M. Chen, under authority granted by the U.S. District Court's Administrative Board, you are hereby ordered to step down from your current judicial capacity pending formal inquiry. Chen opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He stood, slowly. What is this? He asked, voice smaller now. This is absurd. The marshal didn't respond. He didn't need to. He simply said, please place your hands in front of you. The courtroom didn't move. No gasps. No outbursts. Just stillness. Because everyone understood. Pam didn't look triumphant. She didn't smile. She lowered her eyes and quietly gathered her papers. This wasn't vengeance. This was justice, restrained. The second marshal stepped forward and gently placed handcuffs on Edward Chen's wrists. They clicked once. Then again. Chen didn't resist. He just stood there, breathing shallow, robe hanging heavy on his shoulders. The same bench he had ruled from that morning now loomed behind him, distant, unreachable. The courtroom watched. Not with applause. With gravity. Because it's not every day you see a man fall without anyone raising their voice. As the marshals let him out, Pam stood still. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The last line had already been delivered, and it wasn't said by her. It was written, quiet and clear, in the sound of a courtroom finally letting go of fear. Outside, the press waited. Flashes went off. Cameras clicked. But inside, Pam took her seat again, now across from an empty bench. Justice hadn't shouted. It had simply arrived. And the silence that followed said everything.